So we've looked at the rider on the white horse, the first seal. We've looked at the rider on the red horse, the second seal. Now it's time to look at the next rider, the rider on the black horse, or the breaking of the third seal. So we're going to jump back to Revelation chapter 6. And can I have somebody who is happy to read for us? So we're going to read verses 5 and 6.
And when the Lamb broke the third seal, I heard the third living being say, "Come." I looked up and I saw a black horse, and its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice from among the 4 living beings say, "A loaf of wheat, bread, or 3 loaves of barley will cost a day's pay, and don't waste the olive oil and wine."
It's a bit different to the previous ones. Mm-hmm. We're going to go over this for each of the seals. This is going to sound really repetitive by the time we've gone through all of them. But we need to realise, or remember, that we are progressively opening a scroll, which is the title deed for the earth. And this is the process by which creation is being redeemed. Okay, this is Jesus fulfilling his role as the kinsman redeemer. And the plan is being unveiled in stages. It's like it's got little sealed sections, and we're just opening one of those sealed sections at a time, and we're looking at one thing after another. So in verse 5, the third living being says, "Come." Now, some translations will say, "Come and see," but this is a command from the living being to the rider and this horse that's been waiting. Okay. Now, this particular rider is on a black horse. Right. Now, the colour is symbolic, and in the Old Testament, the colour black symbolised extreme famine and destitution. Now, this rider's also holding some scales. We'll talk about that a bit later on. So, when you're starving, you don't care how you look. All right? If you are legitimately starving, you've sold everything you've got to buy what food you can possibly afford, and everything's gone. You're not worried about bathing. You're not worried about keeping up appearances. You've probably also sold all your clothing because you've got nothing, because the priority is to eat. There are some passages in Lamentations which is written in a time essentially where the Jews are being carried off into captivity. And there's references. So Lamentations chapter 4 verse 8, we're not going to look it up, but there's a reference there to faces blacker than soot. In Lamentations chapter 5 verse 10, we've got people with skin who is black, skin that's been blackened due to famine. Okay, so the colour black is not just symbolic of famine, it's literally the colour of famine. Okay, so if people have just if their skin is blackened, it's likely that they're starving, and that's the colour reference that the Jews will have. This rider is carrying some scales and balances. Now, you use scales and balances to ration food. So you're measuring it out to make sure that people are getting their fair portions and the minimum portion that you can possibly give out, because you're trying to make your food last as long as it possibly can during this time. Ezekiel chapter 4 verses 16 and 17 talks about food being weighed out with great care and eaten fearfully. Why do you think he would eat fearfully?
Someone stole it from you.
Exactly. Because if you've got food and everyone around you is starving, is that a safe position to be? Not at all. And this is why people, so when we're talking doomsday preppers, this is why people get all their weaponry sorted, because they know that if they're the only ones with a supply of stuff, everyone's going to be after. The best way to get the food is to bump off the people who are currently holding the food. This third seal, we've had the first seal bringing peace, the second seal bringing an attack from outside, so we've had bloodshed, and then that's followed quickly by famine. Okay, so there's a great famine that hits the earth. Now in verse 6, we had a voice that comes from the midst of the 4 beasts, or the 4 beings. Who's speaking? God. This is a voice from the throne of God. Okay, because we've heard previously that the 4 living beings are in the midpoints of the 4 sides of the throne of God. So the only one on the throne is God. Now if God speaks and says something's going to happen, we're pretty confident that exactly what God says is going to happen is going to come to pass. And what this voice is talking about, so it depends on the translation you've got as to how this is described. But essentially, we've got, in the one that Brad read out for us, we had a loaf of wheat bread or 3 loaves of barley bread will cost a day's pay. Now, if we go back to King James, I'm imagining it's got a denarian or a denarius. Right, so the Greek word is denarian, and the Romans called it a denarius, which is basically a silver coin. And this is the day's pay for the average working man. So if you worked for a whole day, your pay was, here's your coin. Okay? You worked all day. One man would work all day to get one coin. It's like minimum wage. Right? It's a labouring wage. At the same time, King James probably calls, instead of saying a loaf of wheat bread, it probably says a measure of wheat or something. A cord. Yep. So basically, this is a soldier's ration in wartime. This is how much you got to eat. If you were a soldier and you were at war, that was your day's. You got your little package of wheat, and then you'd have to kind of beat that and mill it into flour to be able to bake yourself a nice little loaf to get yourself some nourishment. Now, where does the barley come from? So barley is not as good quality as a grain. So compared to wheat, barley is worth about a third of the price. It doesn't have as good a nutritional value. It is cheaper. And because of that, it's essentially used for animal food. So what is going to happen here is that food prices are going to be so high that you are going to have to work for a whole day just to be able to afford a single ration of food for one person.
Called inflation.
Dramatic inflation. All right? This all very well if you are a strapping young man who can work for a whole day to feed yourself with a soldier's ration. What happens if you've got a family? What happens if you're elderly? What happens if you've got sickness or illness, or you've got somebody who can't work? So people are going to have to resort to animal food because you can get 3 times as much for your one coin or for your day's pay. Okay, so they're going to resort to feeding their families animal food, and they'll consider themselves lucky to be able to do that. But then we've got this curious bit where it says, and don't waste the olive oil and the wine. And some translations will say, but hurt not the olive oil and the wine.
Don't damage.
Oil and wine are luxury items. We know that basic food staples, the wheat and the barley, are going to be scarce and very expensive, and people will be desperate for food. Now, a couple of different schools of thought as to what this bit means. Some people say that oil and wine symbolise spiritual nourishment and blessings, because we've got anointing oil and we've got wine that's used for the Lord's Supper and for other religious purposes. So what they're saying is, well, your spiritual well-being is going to get preserved despite the fact you've got physical stuff going on, right? Physical hardship. Other people say God's judgment might just be a bit selective, so it might spare certain elements of life for certain people in the middle of widespread suffering. Most people believe that this is hinting at economic disparities. So the poor and middle class are really going to struggle because of the scarcity of food and difficulty in earning enough with the dramatic inflation. Right? It's going to be hard to exist. But the rich who have enough money, right? For them, okay, well, I've got more than enough in my bank account. There's no issue with buying the luxury items because they can afford it. The mega rich can afford it. So it's really, there's going to be a disparity there amongst the lower middle class and the people who have got the means to be able to afford. The rich get richer, basically, is what this is talking about. There's also a suggestion that John is talking about Emperor Domitian in AD 92. He decreed that half of the vineyards throughout the provinces were just going to be destroyed, and there was so much resistance to that order that it was rescinded, so he never went ahead with it. But there's a suggestion that John is talking about current modern culture that's happening at the time he's writing this letter, when he's talking about a time when people are going to have plenty of oil and wine but no bread. So this could just be a pop cultural reference to the audience that knows what's going on at the time. Okay, but essentially we've had peace, we've had war, we've now got famine. And we know that depressions and famines and massive inflation often happen after times of war. Right? So this is logically making sense as well as thematically making sense.